Hello again, and welcome back to the Poetry of Emily Dickinson. This week, we are talking about the home, the domestic space, and kind of the politics that undergird that in the 19th century. So let's jump in. Okay, so our guiding questions for this lecture, for our reading, are how does Dickinson engage with gendered expectations in her 19th century American context? And what is the relationship between private and public, the self and society in Dickinson's poetry? And as we'll find out in this lecture, those divides are kind of being artificially reinforced in this period as people are thinking about what it means to be a quote unquote true woman. And maybe a third question that I would add to this that I didn't put on this slide is how does the domestic space, the home, function in Dickinson's poetry? How do those interiors make us feel? What value do they have to the poems that take place in a home, talk about homes? We read some poems that think in a variety of ways about what a home means. So we'll think about that as well. So neither Emily nor her sister Lavinia married. They both spent their whole lives at the homestead. And here's a quote from Lavinia about what the Dickinson family life looked like. She says, she, meaning Emily, had to think. She was the only one of us who had to do that. Father believed and mother loved, and Austin had Amherst, and I had the family to take care of. So we have this kind of articulation of family dynamics. Emily's thinking father is faithful, mother is loving. Austin, their brother, had Amherst, who's a public figure. And Vinny, Lavinia, had to take care of them all. So Austin actually did marry, and he married Susan Gilbert, who he started courting around the same time that Emily became really dear friends with Susan. Austin and Sue were married in 1856, and they set up their home right next door. Susan Dickinson lived a traditional and stylish domestic life in this very stylish home. She kept home, she entertained guests, she raised children, even when Austin began a years-long affair. So here's one poem that I think we can probably read biographically. You know, I'm always warning against doing that too much, but an early poem by Dickinson that kind of talks about this dynamic of Emily and Vinny at home, Susan just around the corner. One sister have I in our house, and one a hedge away. There's only one recorded, but both belong to me. That's the opening stanza. And then the closing stanza, I spilt the dew, but took the morn. I chose this single star from out the wide night's numbers. Sue forevermore. How to read this last stanza is something that scholars talk about a lot. What does it mean that Sue is the single star chosen? And what does Sue forevermore mean? So Susan and Emily were really close. Susan was one of her faithful readers and editors. Emily sent her hundreds of poems over the years, and they regularly corresponded and visited with each other. And many scholars have speculated about the nature of their relationship, in part because of the deeply affectionate and sometimes erotic language that Emily uses in her letters to Sue. Now, other scholars have pointed out that Dickinson did sometimes use similar language in her letters to other female friends, but her closeness to Susan definitely seems unique, if only because of how much poetry she shared with her over the years. Susan was a mathematician and math teacher before she was married, and so some have speculated that the poem, Best Witchcraft is Geometry, which we read last week, actually is a little bit of a love poem to Sue, celebrating this work that she does as a mathematician. And Dickinson has other poems that seem to be addressed to a female lover or talk about wishing, the speaker wishing that she were a man. And even though Dickinson tells us not to read her personae as representative of herself, sometimes it's hard not to, like in this poem. So it's unlikely that we'll ever find the silver bullet that says Emily and Susan were in love, but there's a lot of evidence to support this interpretation, especially early on in their relationship. And when Emily died, Susan was the one who prepared her body, who wrote her obituary, and as we'll learn next week, started the process of preparing Emily's manuscripts for publication. So I mention all of this to give you a sense of the domestic life that Dickinson lived at home with her family, a dear friend, maybe a lover just around the corner. Um, but I also mention it to give you an idea of how Dickinson may or may not fit the mold of a 19th century ideal woman that was beginning to consolidate in this period. And the gendered binary of the home as the women's sphere and the public as the male sphere um, was starting to kind of come to fruition in this period. And so we're going to look at that for the rest of our time together. Whether or not Dickinson was queer, she never married, and so she already didn't fit that kind of expectation of what women should do: keep home, get married, have kids. So this binary between a women's space, men's space is often called separate spheres by scholars. These ideas that I'm talking about here are very much formed by a seminal article in 1966 by Barbara Welter called The Cult of True Womanhood that still is really influential in how scholars of early America in the 19th century think about what was going on in this period and the dynamics that this cult of true womanhood, or the cult of domesticity, as some people call it, was being developed. So Welter highlights 4 virtues that are important for the definition of womanhood in this period. And these virtues are things that were constructed and reinforced by a boom in literature about true womanhood during this period, written by men and women, white men and women, in the northeastern US, beginning at the turn of the 19th century. So this is Dickinson's period and also her geographical region. Some of the folks that we'll meet in this lecture were people that Susan entertained at the Evergreens at her home. So these 4 virtues, piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness, are terms that Welter uses to describe this idea of true womanhood. And they're not necessarily terms that a 19th century woman would have used to describe herself, but they are helpful to organize our thinking about this topic and maybe think about how they're inflected in some of the poems that we read for today. And as I said, true womanhood, this idea of idealized view of what it means to be a woman, was reinforced by basically every facet of society. The development of true womanhood went alongside increasing access to education for young women. But schools like Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, that Dickinson briefly attended, prided themselves on preparing women who embodied these virtues in addition to giving them foundational knowledge in literature, math, science, those things that we associate with school. Religious writers wrote about true womanhood, the importance of domesticity from a biblical perspective. And as I said, a boom in literature reinforced this idea, these developing ideas of womanhood in the 19th century. Literature like marriage manuals and household manuals gave both practical and theoretical advice, and fiction gave women the opportunity to practice virtue alongside characters or see what happens when women in the novels do not act virtuously. So let's look at one example of one of these manuals. The American Woman's Home, or its very long title, The American Woman's Home, or Principles of Domestic Science, being a guide to the formation and maintenance of economical, healthful, beautiful, and Christian homes, was written by Catherine Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1869. Now, you might recognize Harriet Beecher Stowe as the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published almost 2 decades before this manual came out. It wasn't uncommon for women writers like Stowe to publish novels and also to publish manuals like this, which I think really goes to show how pervasive this cult of domesticity really was. So I've pulled a few quotes from this manual to help us better understand these 4 virtues of true womanhood. And then we can think about what that means for Dickinson's poetry in our reading. So the first of these virtues, piety. True womanhood required a woman to be a faithful Protestant Christian and often centered the importance of charity in both senses, being loving and giving to the poor and supporting missions, which was something women really supported in the 19th century, sending out Protestant missionaries from the United States to other countries. But the idea is that all of this has to start at home. If you cultivated these things in your own home, it would naturally flow out into the world around you. So, this quote from the American Women's Home is in a section that's actually talking about missions and talking about how the development of a Christian family unit at home can spread out into a wider Christian culture. Let such a truly Christian family be instituted in any destitute settlement, and soon its gardens and fields would cause the desert to bloom as the rose, and around would soon gather a Christian neighborhood. So it starts at home, and home is the woman's domain. The second virtue that Walter highlights is purity. So maintaining virginity before marriage was an important feature of true womanhood. The Beechers don't really talk about that much in this manual, but they do mention the importance of mothers instilling purity of thought and action for both boys and girls, which I think is interesting. So here's a quote about that. It's a common notion that it is important to secure these virtues to one sex more than the other. And by a strange inconsistency, the sex most exposed to danger is the one selected as least needing care. Yet a wise mother will be especially careful that her sons are trained to modesty and purity of mind. So in addition to these manuals, another way that these virtues of womanhood were explained and reinforced was through fiction. And purity for women was one of those virtues that we see all throughout sentimental and seduction novels in this period. So sentimental novels written in the US and in Britain showed the importance of maintaining purity and the benefits that would come along with it, like a good marriage, a nice house, lots of kids. And other novels, like the seduction novel genre and Charlotte Temple, which is an example of that pictured here, showed what would happen if you didn't maintain your purity. So Charlotte Temple was written by an American English author. And by its publication in, I think, 1794 in the US, immediately took off and was super popular for about half a decade, really until Uncle Tom's Cabin. So the plot of the novel is that Charlotte is a young English schoolgirl who's seduced by a soldier, carried away to pre-revolutionary New York, gives birth to a daughter, and dies disgraced. She's never married. She never has this idealized domestic life. And as I said, it was super popular. But then maybe there's kind of a tension that we can see between these seduction novels, a woman being seduced, and this idea of submission, which is one of the virtues that is identified as central to true womanhood. So true women were expected to submit to their husbands as leaders of the family. That's kind of the bottom line. Just after this quote, the Beechers explain why this is biblical, this idea that the husband has the deciding control and the wife is to obey. So this is rooted in a biblical perspective on the relationship between husbands and wives. So it's connected back to this idea of piety. And then finally, we have domesticity. So true womanhood meant being a savvy, frugal, and beautiful homemaker. I'm going to read this quote at length because I think it's really interesting how the Beechers frame this. But as society gradually shakes off the remnants of barbarism and the intellectual and moral interests of man rise in estimation above the merely sensual, a truer estimate is formed of women's duties and of the measure of intellect requisite for the proper discharge of them. Let any man of sense and discernment become the member of a large household, in which a well-educated and pious woman is endeavoring systematically to discharge her multiform duties. Let him fully comprehend all her cares, difficulties, and perplexities, and it is probable he would coincide in the opinion that no statesman at the head of a nation's affairs had more frequent calls for wisdom, firmness, tact, discrimination, prudence, and versatility of talent than such a woman. So the Beechers frame a woman's role in maintaining the household as akin to being the head of a nation's affairs, right? Having the most important public office is the same as what every woman does every day at her home. They also frame domesticity as a way for women to further civility, which in this period of national expansion and of also those Protestant missionary movements that I talked about in the piety section, that can have a little bit of a nationalist, imperialist cast that scholars have written a lot about over the years. So, what about Dickinson? How do you see the poems that we read for today, or that you will read shortly, responding to this view of true womanhood? And those poems are One Sister Have I in Our House, that we looked at briefly. She Sweeps with Many Colored Brooms. I Know Some Lonely Houses Off the Road. I Tie My Hat, I Crease My Shawl. Don't Put Up My Thread and Needle. Her Sweet Turn to Leave the Homestead. One Need Not Be a Chamber to Be Haunted. And The Bustle in a House. So as you read each of these poems, think about how they are responding to this view of true womanhood. I Tie My Hat, I Crease My Shawl talks about the daily mundane tasks of homemaking, but casts it in a very unexpected light. Think about how the spaces that are inhabited by speakers or that speakers are looking at in this poem relate to this sort of politics of the home that we've looked at. Is there a contrast drawn between the home, the inside, and the public outside of it? And as you're reading, think about Dickinson's attitude towards these interior spaces in which these domestic activities take place. I'll leave you with this quote from a 2018 article by Marissa Grunes. Given Dickinson's seclusion, it is striking to observe the extent to which her poems reveal little confidence in the security of interiors. Rather than protective enclosures, the structures in her poem are porous, prone to invasion, flooding, destruction, ghosts, and madness. And we see that in many of the poems that we read for today, especially when the home is used as a metaphor for something else. When Need Not Be a Chamber to Be Haunted is one really striking example of this. And you might think as you're reading it, whether you agree or disagree with the way this scholar interprets Dickinson's use of interiors and enclosures. That's all I have for you today. I'm looking forward to being back with you next week when we talk about Dickinson and print, the early endeavors to print her work, and also the attitudes towards the literary marketplace that we see in Dickinson's poetry. Thanks for watching, and I will see you then.